Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a combat veteran and former advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense, and which all of you can see in person at the National Conversation in Dallas, together with Judge Napolitano and Natalie Brunell on the 4th of October. So I will leave information in the description. So welcome back, Colonel. I hope, all is well.
Good to talk with you, Glenn.
So when Trump took office, he was going to, as we all know, end the Ukraine war in 24 hours. Then he extended it. Again, I think he genuinely wants it to end. But the whole premise of walking away from this appears to have changed. Over the last few days or weeks, we see now that Trump is putting pressure on India and others to stop trading with Russia. In a tweet, he suggested that Ukraine must go on the offensive if it wants to win. And also, there's now reports of the US possibly sending thousands of Iran long-range missiles. I'm not sure. What do you make of this turn of events?
Well, I think it is vintage Trump. Trump is someone with a machine gun firing in all conceivable directions. And what he really wants or thinks changes from day to day. He's very impulsive. There is no coherent strategic framework for anything. There is absolutely no understanding whatsoever of Russia or Ukraine or Eastern Europe. It's all very foreign to him. So I don't think we can reach any hard conclusions about what he means. Let's look at what he wants to do. That's what's important. First of all, I think he decided after the Alaska summit that there was really nothing he could do to stand up there and bring peace to Eastern Europe with the cooperation of President Putin and potentially Zelensky and the Europeans. So I think he understands now that the Europeans have a different agenda from him. Zelensky has a different agenda, and President Putin's position is unchanging. That's not a problem for President Trump. He recognizes that that position is not changing, but he now is frustrated and wishes that he could have staged a wonderful photo opportunity, much like the Alaska event, in the future at some peace summit. That's not going to happen. Remember, President Trump is about optics. This is a pure showman. This is simply the latest episode in the reality TV show called The Trump White House. And he's not going to get the kind of photo op that he wanted, where he could stand in the middle and claim to be peacemaker. So I think he's kind of walked away from it. On the other hand, he still is under enormous pressure from the neocons inside the Beltway. And these are the same people that want perpetual war in the Middle East. They want to balkanize Iran. They want to balkanize Russia. The Russia strategy has failed miserably. So now, they're telling Trump, well, you've got to keep this going somehow. You've got to show that Ukraine is on life support. So give them these cruise missiles. Now, when will these arrive? In what numbers? Will they make any difference? It's hard to tell. But he published a tweet with a statement saying that, the previous administration hadn't done enough to confer capability on Ukraine to really take the offensive. Of course, that's all nonsense. And the bottom line is, it doesn't matter what you do if you can pinprick strikes with cruise missiles all over the place. Makes absolutely no difference if you're losing the close fight. We have this thing we call the deep fight and the close fight. The deep fight involves these long-range strike weapons, and they're very important. But if you think that you're going to win the war without a close fight, you've lost your mind. Eventually, the ground forces have to collide. Well, they've collided, and Ukraine has lost the close fight. And he doesn't seem to understand the difference. But we shouldn't be surprised by that. This is not someone who has a background in military affairs, international relations, diplomacy, none of those things. This is someone who comes to office as a businessman and sees the world through this lens. That's why we hear constantly about deal, 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 deal. But we don't put together deals on the spur of the moment, and we don't hammer out deals between two people or three people or four people. These things in international diplomacy take months and years sometimes. And then, the ultimate meeting occurs, something is signed and agreed, and everybody can live with it, and you move on to the next item. He has no experience with that, and that's not the way he thinks. In many ways, I think President Trump encapsulates one of the essentials of American character, and that is Americans have no patience. Americans do not understand that the world is not a giant microwave oven. They think in terms of shove it into the microwave oven, give it 30 seconds, and out comes something that you can consume. That's not the nature of the world. And now that may work in American politics to some extent, but it doesn't work in international relations. It doesn't work with military affairs. So I think he's kind of walked away on one side because he can't extract any personal benefit from this. He can't be the hero in the story. But on the other hand, once again, he bends over to try and satisfy or mollify people inside the Beltway who insist, oh, you've got to keep supporting Ukraine. You've got to keep sending everything to Israel. We've got to destroy Iran. We've got to redraw the map and so forth. So he's listening to both groups, and that's why you get these almost schizophrenic outcomes.
Well, it seems that Russia is now, losing its faith in the whole diplomatic process as well, if it had any to begin with, of course. But it seems to be also intensifying. Not just, last night I think was the second largest attack on Ukraine with drones and various kinds of missiles. But we also see some push towards Kherson city that is across the Dnieper, not necessarily with soldiers yet, but these efforts to at least establish a very powerful drone control, which is assumed that soldiers would start to cross at some point now. I'm not sure what this means, if they're gonna have ambitions to go towards Odessa. But I did want to ask you, though, what do you see happening on the battlefield at the moment? Because it just seems to be going from bad to worse for the Ukrainian army.
Well, I think this has been true for many, many months now. It's just gotten to the point of being more horrific than ever before. Russian losses were in the double digits, 30, 40, 50 people a day. Now the Russian losses are single digits, that is 10 or less on a particular day. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are effectively naked on the battlefield. They have no air and missile defense to speak of. They don't have the benefits of all the satellite imagery being transmitted instantaneously to key nodes. An awful lot of the critical nodes in Chazov Yar, in Chernikov and other places have been utterly and completely destroyed. Large numbers of NATO officers and non-commissioned officers have been killed in these strikes. We don't hear anything about it, but they have been. The Russians are in control of the entire battle space. There's no question about it. And this is irretrievable. It's not something that can be fixed by sending over cruise missiles or any other single weapon system. And then you have the manpower drain. As I understand it, they've now allowed 14,000 men between the ages of 18 and 25 or 18 and 30 to cross the border from Ukraine into neighboring Poland or Slovakia and elsewhere. That's rather astonishing. I mean, what are you doing that for if you think you're going to put up some sort of serious resistance? It almost looks as though the Ukrainian government now is schizophrenic. On the one hand, it wants to maintain the fiction that they're still resilient and capable, but on the other hand, they're beginning to surrender to the demands of their own population to put an end to this. I don't know which overtakes the other. It's a very strange situation. The key thing, though, is the war is going to end. Now, when does it end? Now, you mentioned Kherson and also Odessa. There are Russian special forces in the western part of Ukraine. They've already crossed the river. They're providing data, targeting data for Russian systems. Odessa has been under ferocious attack. All of its military capability is gone. whatever storage was available to it in terms of fuel and ammunition has been destroyed. I'd be very surprised if the Russians do not cross the river in strength and move south to seize Odessa. And again, Odessa was never Ukrainian. Odessa is a Russian city. It was founded by Russians. It has been a Russian-speaking city. It's no accident that the memorial statue to Catherine the Great was removed early on by the Ukrainians because she was the one that created effectively this thing we call New Russia, Novorussia. So I imagine that will happen. What is is an unknown at this point is what do the Russians do about Kiev? What do they do about this lingering facade of a government? And the sad part is that when President Putin, not directly probably, but certainly Foreign Minister Lavrov stated categorically that Zelensky is not a legitimate president anymore. He's not, strictly speaking, elected. He doesn't represent any sort of democratic process, however much of a facade that may be, and that therefore they're not going to meet with him. That seems not to have sunk in with President Trump, who now has turned back towards Zelensky as though he wants to help him. This is the man that offended him, insulted him, and showed him absolutely no respect in the Oval Office. I mean, it's a very strange set of circumstances. But, this is kind of President Trump. On the other hand, if you look at developments in Western Europe, J.D. Vance is over there criticizing the suppression of free speech in places like Great Britain, France, and Germany, where they're very serious. President Trump has expressed support for the Alternative for Germany, which is a legitimate political movement and has actually won recent elections and is now in danger of being further suppressed and erased from the political arena, at least temporarily. Very strange set of circumstances. So, trying to understand where we're headed next is a question that is not easy to answer with President Trump.
Yeah, you mentioned that Trump doesn't understand Russia, but I often get the impression that the other political leaders, both in the United States and across Europe, also don't understand Russia. What do you think that the NATO countries do not get about Russia, and why is it that they can't comprehend what Russia wants?
Well, first of all, you're a European, so you're closer to this than I am. So I'm speculating. I don't have hard, fast facts to back my statements. First of all, I think there are European leaders who do understand the truth, but they've chosen the lie. They've chosen the fiction, the narrative that says Russia is evil and a danger and a threat, and they've hung their future on it. They know that at the moment they admit that what they've said about Russia is false, what they've imputed to Russia is false, and that Russia's national security interests in eastern Ukraine are legitimate and always have been from the very beginning. And the reason for this conflict is all about the rights of Russian citizens to speak and read and write their own language and have their own culture in schools. The minute they admit something like that, they're through. They've had it. And I think the globalist governments, whether it's Starmer, Macron, or Merz, are in a lot of trouble. There's no question about it. The other aspect of this, of course, is the debt problem. We're all locked into the debt spiral. At some point, we're going to spiral into the dirt. The financial system is going to collapse. And when that happens, we'll have to reset the currency. And there will be a certain period of time where there's chaos. But eventually, you will get new governments because you have people like the Alternative for Germany and all the European states right now. But we're not there yet. We're in this twilight zone between what I just described and the past, which is Russia's evil, Russia's bad, we all have to stand fast. And making these impossible commitments financially to military buildup. Germany can't pay for itself as it is. When I was over there the last time, everybody told me flat out that the medical system, the medical insurance system was bankrupt. That's been going on for years. It's bankrupt all over the place, but particularly in Germany and Austria. Well, if that's the case, how are you going to fund yourself when you try to build up a military structure? And it takes conservatively speaking, 10 years to build a viable new military establishment. And that's really what everybody has to do. They've got to start over. That's why all this business about a European peace force or something on the ground in Western Ukraine is just nonsense. It's hot air. It's meaningless nonsense. What are you going to send over there? The president of Poland has wisely, Nawrocki, the new one, has wisely said, no, there will be no Polish troops on the ground in Ukraine, period. Well, they've already been over there. They had several thousand people killed or wounded, and they don't want to go back, and they realize the folly of this whole thing. That's good news. And they need to go further, obviously. But I think the Orban model is going to become increasingly popular in Central East Europe. And that spells the end of the EU and NATO. All of these things are coming. They're on the horizon. Just as if you look at our situation here at home, gold is now the reserve currency, not the dollar. Nassim Taleb has been telling everybody that for the last 6 to 12 months. He's right. Our position is very fragile. All of these things are going to sort of come together and crash simultaneously. And it's going to prevent any further nonsense in terms of war in Ukraine or war with Russia. It'll all end.
Yeah, well, yeah, I am closer to Europe, but I always make the point this is the side I don't understand the least. I mean, I can understand the Russian position. They see this as an existential threat, that is NATO's incursion in Ukraine. They will do what it takes. I get this. The Ukrainians see the Russian invasion as an existential threat. I can understand why they're fighting. If the United States wants to pivot to Asia and then unload this disaster of a war on the Europeans, and they're willing to do it, well, great. I can understand the American position as well, but I don't understand that they're always the European. I heard some theories that is that they're being captured by their own narratives. There's a opportunism perhaps to centralize power in the EU. They would like to prevent the Americans from leaving. There's just this good old-fashioned hatred of Russia. So the Russophobia keeps living strong. But also one which is very convincing, which is the unwillingness to give up on a very powerful proxy army, because they built up this army in Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers who could function as a very powerful containment or balance of the Russians. And if they accept the neutral option for Ukraine, in the future they might have to fight on their own. I'm not sure.
Well, it depends on what you understand neutrality to mean. And that's why the Austrian state treaty is continually raised. I've been raising it certainly since 2014. In fact, I couldn't understand why there wasn't a plebiscite, because it was patently obvious that Ukraine was deeply divided along ethnic, linguistic, and cultural lines. But we're all caught up in this fantasy that everybody has to live with everybody inside a multinational, multicultural, multilingual, whatever construct. This got started under the Clintonistas, as we call them, under the Clinton administration in the 90s. And we've been struggling with this ever since. That's why you can't see what's happened in Ukraine as separate and distinct of what we did in Bosnia-Herzegovina or in Kosovo. Everything is aimed at the same objective, which is to transform Europe into this multicultural mess with open borders and no national identity, no national culture. It's a sort of Bolshevism in a new form. The interesting thing is, where Bolshevism started has become the bulwark of national identity, national culture. And Russia is standing up for Europe in ways that no one ever anticipated. The Russians are telling everybody, we're Russian, we're not going to become something else. Why don't you be Europeans? Eventually the Europeans are going to understand this. I think the population in Germany is beginning to grasp it. Even some of the people in Poland are beginning to see past their sort of limiting hatred of Russia and all things Russians to figure out that, the EU is not a place where you as a Pole or a Hungarian or anybody, German, can be what you are. The EU is this highly centralized octopus that is there to dictate to you everything that you will be. And this thing we call European values, which is absurd on its face, is being used as an instrument to beat everybody into submission. Open your borders, admit more Africans, admit more people from the Middle East and from Southwest Asia, pour in, and then we'll all be happy. You know, even in Germany, where the Germans have put up with this nonstop since 2015, 10 years, they finally begun to realize this is a catastrophe. It's impossible. But, when you say, do you understand Russia? I don't think they completely understand what I just described, but they're beginning to sense it.
Yeah, well, how do you see as I think most people now recognizing we're moving towards the final stages of this war? That is, more and more very significant breakthroughs are occurring at a increasingly, increasingly often. But how would this war end then? Not just for Ukraine, but also for NATO, given that a lot has changed since 2022. And again, initially NATO had it was argued had a new mission. It was stronger than ever before. But I guess a lot of this was premised on NATO actually defeating Russia. So now that we are, NATO heading for defeat, how do you see what will I guess the transatlantic community look like at the end of this war?
Well, you just raised an important question, and you said transatlantic. Remember, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was composed really of states that bordered the Atlantic Ocean. It was never meant to be a continental structure. We transformed it in the 1990s into this growing, expanding continental structure. And the goal was to advance all the way to the Urals and beyond. In other words, to incorporate everybody into this sort of EU-NATO construct. That has clearly, indisputably failed. That's obvious. So if you're a Pole right now, and I was talking to some Poles recently, I asked them the very question. I said, what do you do? And I think the Poles, like many Europeans, for different kinds of reasons, keep looking for someone who's going to help to guarantee their existence. In other words, who's going to be daddy? Which, of course, was the word that Rutte used to describe the Europeans or something, or used to describe Trump as the sort of godfather of NATO, which, of course, Trump loves. That's music to his ears. And the truth is there will be no godfather. De Gaulle saw this coming back in the 1960s. Bismarck back in the 1870s kept saying, all these decisions of importance have to be national decisions. They have to be based on national interests. This business of communal decision-making. He used to criticize the European collective, the concert of Europe, as nonsense. In other words, the Poles need to decide what's in their interest, and that's what I told them. And if you think that you can sign a deal with Washington that guarantees your security where you live, you're very much mistaken. You might as well go back to 1939 and make the very dumb decisions that you made at that point, when you always had to make a choice. You had to choose one way or the other. Is it going to be Germany or is it going to be the Soviet Union? You chose neither, and what happened? You were ground into bits by the Soviet Union and Germany. And by the way, Piłsudski, their leader at the time, he died obviously before this, but he warned on his deathbed, you've got to make a choice. Now, the Poles cannot build Fort Trump and gratify Trump's ego and expect that that is their ticket to permanent security and salvation. That's not going to work. We don't live in Europe. The Europeans live in Europe. None of the Europeans, frankly speaking, seem to want to be in close partnership with any of their neighbors. But the truth is that has to happen. And when you look at Ukraine right now, and you're right, this is grinding to a halt in Ukraine. It's coming to an end. Who decides what happens to the rest of Ukraine? Are the Poles, Lithuanians, Slovaks, Hungarians, Romanians, Moldovans, are they all going to say, well, we'll just wait here quietly until 800,000 or 900,000 Russian troops arrive on our borders? Or are they going to sit down with President Putin and his team and say, we're ready to talk about what this post-war Ukraine will look like. And they are the ones who need to have that conversation, not France, not Britain, and not Germany. Now, you could argue that the Germans, for reasons of history over the last 1,000 years, have deep roots in Central East Europe, no question about it. I think they ought to be very interested. But the rest of the West Europeans, absolutely not. What have they got to do with it? And what do we have to do with it? We can support it, and I think that's what President Trump should consider. We'll be happy to support such a conference, and we will sign on for the solution that you and Moscow reach collectively. And I think that could be done. But right now, no one is saying that. No one is thinking about that because the Poles are looking at the EU. They're looking at NATO. So is everybody else. And everybody says, well, I can't do that because I'm dependent on subsidies from the EU, new money from the EU money machine in Brussels. If I do that, then I lose access to the new money machine. Well, what if access to the new money machine sets you up as a target for future destruction in future wars that you don't want to fight because you're part of that organization called NATO and the EU? Eventually, people will come around to sorting through this, but right now, that's not where they are.
Yeah, I think this all the search for this daddy or permanent security, as you said, I think this is this was the dream of the unipolar order because traditionally states have to accept the security competition. That is, one state enhances security, it could diminish the security of another. But after the Cold War, this whole idea was, we don't have to take into consideration the security of others to mitigate security competition because within NATO, under the US umbrella, will simply be so powerful. It doesn't matter if the Russians are alienated, they will just have to find their place in this, under the dominance of the political West. But
Then there's another interesting aspect to this.
yeah,
If we go back to 1914, the system sort of came into existence or evolved in the sort of 10 to 15 years before the outbreak of World War I into this set of automatic triggers that sent people to war, even though they, at the beginning of it, may not have had any role in it, may not have really been affected by it. So the question that I ask Europeans all the time is, why do you want to be part of alliances that could ultimately drag you into a war that you really don't want to fight, simply because that alliance has theoretically guaranteed your security? The only real guarantor of security for any country is its own people. The Finns are a wonderful example because the Finns, for years, they could mobilize 850,000 men within the spaces of, say, 48, 72 hours, well-trained, well-equipped, ready to fight. And that operated in their minds as a deterrent. I think it did. I don't think the Russians, after World War II, were interested in going back into Finland under any circumstances. But nevertheless, the Finns were in a position to guarantee their own security. And all of a sudden, at the end of this long period of Soviet-Western conflict, when there is none anymore, decides to join a NATO alliance, which has committed itself to a condition of permanent hostility towards Russia. That's insane. It makes no sense. The Swedes are very similar, but the Finns in particular built a very robust guarantee for themselves. My argument to people is that could be done all across Europe. But the notion that you want to bet the farm, as we say in English, on the arrival of U.S. forces in a crisis or conflict from the United States is crazy. Technology has changed. Eisenhower made the comment in 1956, we'll never see another Normandy. If anybody tried to do such a thing, it would be destroyed. What about the Soviet submarines? What about their missiles? Well, those things were primitive in those days compared with what we have today. So the notion that we could cross oceans with impunity and introduce hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million or 2 million troops into the battle, whether it's Asia or Europe, is crazy. It's not going to happen. So why would you want to tie yourself to such an empty guarantee? And I think privately, President Trump feels that way. I know that he felt very strongly that the Europeans should become their own first responders. And I think that's behind his demand for higher defense spending. Unfortunately, defense spending doesn't necessarily equal military capability. What I'm talking about is real military capability the Europeans create for themselves for their own purposes to guarantee their own security. That's what's needed. And there's nothing to prevent people from being what I would call limited liability partners. That means that the Poles cooperate with the Germans or with the Slovaks or with the Czechs or with the Lithuanians for whatever specific purpose. But you don't necessarily sign on for a permanent alliance that triggers automatically a war that would involve you that you don't want to fight. So it is very strange to me with the experience of World War I and World War II, why the Poles and the people in Eastern Europe in general would not understand that and would not seek a different solution from the one that they're part of right now.
I'm not sure if their historical memory is that great. I mean, I saw the Finnish president Stubb when he was talking to Trump, and his historical lesson was, you can't appease Russia, you have to confront. But the whole Finnish history was they made themselves neutral, and then the wars ended, and they had a successful role as neutral state until they abandoned it. So it looked as if the solution should be that Ukraine should have been more what Finland was, but instead Finland is becoming what Ukraine is. But but you argue that as NATO is dying, we have this. There has to be a need now for a new thinking about European security and the security architecture. But if, let's say, we don't have that political maturity at the moment within Europe because they all told each other that Putin is Hitler, what to expect happening now that the front lines begin to unravel? Because I get the impression that the Russians would like to do some of this gradually very deliberately, so they don't create too much panic in Washington and the European capitals. But in this panic, states can often do stupid things, and I think the Russian patience is also starting to go a bit thin as we're now speaking very openly and cheering when Western missiles are fired into Russian cities. So, what do you think is the great risk here as we're entering the final stage of the war?
Well, the Russian interest, clearly stated at this point, is we want a solution to the conflict that does not require us in 2, 5, 10 years' time to resume the conflict. In other words, we don't want to refight this again. Now, they're in the happy position of controlling a lot of the critical assets, not just terrain, but the capability to dominate. And finally, remember, the real question from the beginning was, who is willing to fight? The Russians were always willing to fight because their national security interests were at risk in eastern Ukraine, and ultimately today in Kiev because of the nature of the regime there. What were we willing to do? Well, Americans weren't willing to fight anywhere. As far as I can tell, only the Poles were willing to go over in any sort of numbers and stand shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainians and fight with them. That didn't work out very well, and I think President Novrotsky has wisely said no more. We're not going to repeat that folly. The key thing is we're not willing to fight in Ukraine. Russia is. Russia has always been willing to fight there because it's in their vital strategic interest. So if we're not willing to fight, we had better sit down and do the talking, and that's what I would tell the Europeans. If you're not willing to fight, and I would add something else, Europeans really aren't capable of fighting. They don't have the forces at their disposal. So they turn to us, but the truth is, our ground force is really quite small. And our air and naval forces, while substantial and robust, are not really designed for continental warfare. What we're going to see happen in the United States over the years ahead is a reversion of the United States back to what it really was before World War I, a maritime and aerospace power. not a land power. We are only a land power in the Western Hemisphere, where we live. Just as Russia is primarily a land power. It's a land power on the Eurasian continent. It is not necessarily a maritime power. It has a navy, but it's quite modest. It has air forces, but those are equally modest compared with what we deploy. But we're a different kind of country. So we're going to revert back to what we have historically been. We're not going to remain a global land power. Just look at the size and the scope of the forces that we have around the world. And what have you seen happen over the last 80 years? They've declined dramatically. With each passing decade, we've had fewer forces on the ground overseas. Pretty soon, we won't have any in the Eastern Hemisphere, certainly not beyond special forces and special operations forces. So I guess what I'm trying to say is people need to look at themselves from a geographical, historical, and cultural situation. Everybody says, well, America is in retreat, it's in decline. No, we're reverting to what is natural. Our position is in the Western Hemisphere. That doesn't mean we don't want to do business. It doesn't mean that we're not willing to help to some extent, but we cannot maintain a position in Eurasia on land that we did 80 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 30 years ago. It's not possible anymore, nor does it make sense for us to do so. But the whole attempt has been to demonize Russia and China and eventually Iran, these powers, in order to justify massive defense spending in the United States and the commitment of forces overseas. But that's waning. Americans don't really support that. And they have other more important priorities at home.
It's an interesting observation that the Western countries don't want to fight and die for Ukraine, because the former advisor of Zelensky, Alexei Arestovich, he was making the exact same point. He said, ironically, the only two countries who would fight and die for us is Russia and Belarus, and they happen to be, the one they're fighting against now. So, but it's just, it just took me to my last final question, which is, how do you see the relationship between Russia and the West after this war? Because I'm getting some indications that there's some growing resentfulness on the Ukrainian side, that they more, they thought they were gonna be under some protective umbrella by the West, and this is why they fought instead of taking the peace agreement in Istanbul. I mean, this is what they were promised: fight, and we'll give you everything you need to win. Instead, they're seen to be used by proxy. You hear a lot of leading political figures now, pro-Western ones, who are quite upset that the Europeans essentially see them as cannon fodder, something to throw at the Russians. From very leading, this comes from leading European voices, by the way, as well. Do you think Ukraine will have a split with the West as well after this war? Because 69% of Ukrainians now say that they want an immediate end to the fighting through negotiations, while the Europeans don't even want to talk to Russia. So it doesn't look as if all the talk about standing with Ukraine really corresponds that much with reality. It's more like standing with Zelensky now, it seems.
Well, the Russians historically refer to Ukraine as Russia's unfaithful wife. It's probably not a good analogy. I think the Ukrainians particularly, and you've got to go, once again, I understand, you're familiar with this. There is this thing called Western Ukraine, much of which used to be called Ruthenia under the Austrian Empire, and then it was Galicia, was part of this, Volhynia. These things are really in the West, and their center of gravity was more or less Lvov, which was previously Lemberg under the Austrians. The people that live there view themselves, and I happen to agree with them, I think they're right, as fundamentally Western. By the way, I think President Putin agrees with that, would not dispute that for a second. President Putin has said on more than one occasion that these people would probably be much happier in some sort of confederation with the Poles or their neighbors in other capacities. That I think is indisputable. Then you have these people in the middle, sort of halfway across Western Ukraine. There's another section of the country that is a hybrid of Russia and Ukraine. And then as you go further and further east, it becomes more and more Russified. This is a hard nut to crack, but this has always been the problem with pretending that this whole construct called Ukraine was a modern, integrated political structure, a modern nation state. It wasn't, and it has never been. So I don't know exactly what happens after it's over, but I think the Russians are going to treat us in the West for at least the next 2 decades with considerable suspicion. They will maintain with us what I would call a cold peace. Now, that's despite whatever we do, because I think at some point things here will change and people will reach out to the Russians and want a better relationship. There's no question about that. We've already got them. And privately, there are people associated with President Trump who would like to do that now, but Trump seems to be incapable of leading that on his own. So it's going to be cold peace as far as Moscow is concerned with us. The Russian struggle with identity that says we are as Asiatic as we are European. That was the argument Dostoevsky made back in the 1870s. He said, we're not really Europeans. We're almost Asiatic, and the Europeans have been bad trouble for us. We keep becoming involved in their wars. We should walk away from these Europeans. But that never really happens, as you know, because the Russians are, strictly speaking, European people. They're not part of the Asiatic complex, per se. There was this old story told by the British ambassador in St. Petersburg or in Moscow in Russia during the Napoleonic Wars. And he was very frustrated. He wrote back to London, and they kept asking him, what does the Tsar want? Tsar Alexander I, what's he want? What is his attitude? What are his feelings? And he kept saying, well, when he's in St. Petersburg, he's very pro-Western. But when you talk to him in Moscow, he's not. He said, so it's this schizophrenia. What is Russia? Is it Asiatic? Is it European? And apparently with Alexander I, who, frankly speaking, was German more than anything else, it depended on which capital he happened to reside in at any given point in time. But I think we have poisoned the water, we Americans, very much so, with the Russians for a long time. That's sad. If there is the turnover that I think is coming in the ruling elites, in the political elites, the ruling classes in Western Europe, then I think things could improve there faster with Russia. But with us, not for a very long time.
Well, Colonel Macgregor, thank you as always for your insights. It's going to be some interesting weeks and months ahead. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, Glenn.